Traveling Kansas Smoky Valley Ranch is underwritten in part by a grant from the Dane G. Hansen Foundation, enriching our lives by sharing our unique stories in Kansas, and by the Buffalo Bill Cultural Center in Oakley, who invite you to begin your travel and experience the Western Vistas Historic Byway, including Fort Wallace, Scott City, and Oakley.
This program is brought to you by the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism. Find out more information about Kansas communities at travelks.com.
I'm Matt Bain. I'm the Western Kansas Conservation Program Manager, and I've been the manager at Smoky Valley Ranch for about 5 years now. The Nature Conservancy in Kansas purchased Smoky Valley Ranch in 2000, and at the time was the largest acquisition in the state for conservation in the state's history. The Nature Conservancy in Kansas operates just as it does everywhere else, in that we identify that major intact native system and try to conserve what's left. So in Kansas, we work in grasslands. In western Kansas, we work in the short mixed grass prairie. So the overall goal is to conserve what's left of the native prairie here. Cropland's important. The Conservancy invests heavily in its conservation. But we also feel that the native prairie that's left is also important for the native wildlife that have depended on it, but also for the ranchers that depend on that same native grassland for their livelihood. The reality is ranchers take care of the last wild places in Kansas. So ranching is fundamental to what we do here on the property. The hiking trails on the west side of the ranch are open to the public year-round. They're open for hiking and horseback riding. A person can really just come and help themselves. We do have a number of interpretive points along the trail, so a person can learn about what they're seeing in terms of the native plant community and the native wildlife. We have everything from lesser prairie chickens to black-tailed prairie dogs, managing for a real diverse plant community. And the thing that's really interesting in this part of the ranch, we have a lot of the human history that's happened on the ranch. Probably 3/4 of the history, of the really notable history that's happened in this area, happened adjacent to the hiking trail. And so it's really interesting to see those examples of how the natural history and the human history of an area are really connected, and they're really inseparable. So as a person hikes through the trail or rides along on horseback, you can hear some of the stories of the human history, and you can look over and see the springs that the people use as they pass through the area. And this area was in very close proximity to the Boderfield Overland Dispatch Trail, the Smoky Hill Trail, and so it was just a real highway for early explorers and settlers over time.
The 17,300-acre Smoky Valley Ranch is located about halfway between the Buffalo Bill Cultural Center in Oakley and the El Cordillo Museum in Scott City, along the Western Vistas Historic Byway. The Niobrara Chalk Formation chalk beds were deposited during the Cretaceous period, when the Western Interior Seaway divided North America into two land masses. Fossils of swimming and flying reptiles dating back 85 million years have been found on the ranch. Their ancient clams and oysters are also common. Ecologically, these Niobrara chalk formations are unique nesting habitat for hawks, cliff swallows, and rock wrens, as well as an important habitat for the endangered green toad. and many other native amphibians and reptiles. The chalk flat prairie is a unique feature of western Kansas, where over 80% of the prairie has been converted to some other use. The Nature Conservancy recognizes that cropland is incredibly important for the local economy and for feeding a growing world. Cropland is becoming increasingly important to the Conservancy's mission of conserving the land and waters upon which all life depends. However, not only has grassland conservation been the highest priority of the Nature Conservancy in Kansas for over 25 years, it's also critical for Kansas' multi-billion-dollar cattle industry and local ranchers. The Conservancy is dedicated to joining its ranching partners in keeping what little is left of the remaining prairie in grass and finding ways to achieve both a healthy grassland ecosystem and a profitable ranching operation. Ranchers simply are the stewards of nearly all remaining grassland in Kansas and are among the Conservancy's most important conservation partners. Throughout the plains and certainly in Kansas, livestock grazing is the most important grassland conservation tool. Since the Cretaceous period, water on the high plains has been a precious resource. But with today's altered hydrology and declining regional aquifer, it is increasingly so. The Ogallala Aquifer does not occur beneath the Smoky Valley Ranch, but it does occur just to the south, west, and north. The region's premier example of the Ogallala Spring occurs along a different tributary on the Smoky Hill River, Ladder Creek, supplying historic Scott Lake State Park about 12 miles south of here. Hydrologists estimate that the majority of the water that feeds the spring on the 12-mile creek originated from a large, ephemeral wetland called the Playa, several miles northwest of the ranch. This connection between settlement and human activity along the Smoky Hill River demonstrates the importance of clean, stable water in these arid lands throughout history. Perhaps more importantly, it demonstrates the timeless reality of the water cycle, that how we impact water in one area has implications in nearly every other point along its way through the cycle. The direct ancestors of today's bison dominated the landscape, just as their descendants would come to do. The ancient bisons were 25% larger than modern bison, at nearly 8 feet tall and 15 feet long. About 30 years after the last Butterfield Overland Dispatch stagecoach traversed the ranch, an area rancher showed researchers from the University of Kansas a large bison tooth and led them to this very spot. In 1895, University of Kansas researchers discovered a human-made spear point inside an ancient bison skeleton at the bottom of a ravine. Dating back more than 10,000 years, this was the first evidence that humans inhabited North America. To their surprise, the researchers found 12 ancient bison skeletons in the creek bed below this cliff. The researchers had an idea of how old these ancient bison were, and to their knowledge, humans didn't inhabit North America until thousands of years later. The researchers took photographs, published articles, and deposited the point safely in the University of Kansas Museum of Natural History. That is until, as the story goes, the university administrator discovered the importance of the point, took it to a fundraising event for KU Medical School to show it off to friends, and the point was lost to this day. It is certain that people on Smoky Valley Ranch have made a living on the water, the grassland, and the creatures that inhabit them for 10,400 years and counting. The springs near the Bison Jump have supplied clean water for residents and travelers throughout history, including notable explorers and scouts such as Buffalo Bill, John C. Fremont, Kit Carson, and Wild Bill Hickok. They also supplied water to the Pawnee Indian Village, the Smoky Hill Springs Staging Station, General Custer's Camp, homesteaders, and countless travelers arriving in 4 crossings of the Smoky Hill Trail. During recent record-breaking drought, all other water on the 17,300-acre Smoky Valley Ranch had vanished, other than a single spring-fed pool about a quarter-mile south of here. Not only did this pool not dry up, but the water level remained unchanged at an incredible 8 feet deep. A Pawnee Indian village was located near the confluence of 12 Mile Creek and Smoky Hill River. Prior to the Nature Conservancy's ownership of Smoky Valley Ranch, a local Logan County resident collected nearly 200 points and other artifacts from this site. Many of these artifacts are on display at the Fort Wallace Museum. Just southeast over the hill, General George Armstrong Custer and about 100 troops of the 7th Cavalry made a day camp on the morning of July 16, 1867. This was the first significant stop along the forced march down the Smoky when General Custer famously left his post at Fort Wallace, disobeying orders, to attend to his wife at Fort Riley. The location and details of the camp were recorded as part of his court-martial testimony, where after he was relieved from the Army for 1 year without pay, but then called back after serving only 10 months of his court-martial sentence. The Smoky Hill Springs staging station was located on the east side of the valley about half a mile south. The staging station, which ran from 1864 to 1869, served as a stop for shelter, supplies, and fresh horses along the Butterfield Overland Dispatch Trail. The stage line primarily began carrying freight to Denver, and after the Colorado Gold Rush, primarily passengers from Atchison, Kansas to Denver, Colorado. In 1868, the fare for this trip was $58.78. Unlike most settlers and miners traveling the Smoky Hill with wagons pulled by 1 or 2 oxen, lucky to make the 10 miles a day, the Butterfield Overland Dispatch used teams of horses and established staging stations such as the one located on the Smoky Valley Ranch to keep fresh horses in front of them that could travel nearly 20 miles a day. The staging station was a sod dugout structure, which was designed for a cover and to prevent being burned out during skirmishes with Plains Indians. In 1866 issue of Harper's Weekly, Theodore Davis provides a detailed description of the staging station and a prolonged Indian battle that occurred there in November of 1865, in which the Indians overtook and set fire to an ambulance. There were several very prolonged bloody conflicts, primarily with the Cheyenne and Arapaho, at the staging station in 1865. Just a few years later, the gold rush would slow, the railroads would develop, and the Butterfield Overland Dispatch stage line would come to an end. Davis's detailed sketches and description of the terrain placed the staging station just west of the prominent ridge and bluffs straight south of here. Because of this, many people searched for the remains of the station in that area, and the actual location wasn't discovered until the 1980s. In fact, it was the last found staging station along the trail. The site was eventually farmed and restored to grass. Today, all that remains of the staging station are shallow depressions. In 2007, black-footed ferrets were reintroduced at the Smoky Valley Ranch. Wild-born ferrets can still be found on the ranch today. In partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the ranch will remain as a host site for black-footed ferret recovery, which is one of the most endangered mammals in North America. The Conservancy is committed to ensuring that their decision to manage for prairie dogs in the interior 10% of the Smoky Valley Ranch does not negatively impact nearby ranching operations. Historically, prairie dog colonies would have been very dynamic over time and space, moving to new areas in response to grazing and fire, and prior to causing long-term changes in the native plant community. In addition to the biological diversity, the geological diversity of the Smoky Valley Ranch is impressive, as exemplified by the unique sandstone at this site. Chalk prairie best represents the mixed grass prairie, where buffalo grass intermingles with big bluestem. These practices are good for both ranchers and wildlife and represent the Nature Conservancy's people-centered strategy for long-term conservation. If it's not good for people, it's not going to last. Smoky Valley Ranch was homesteaded by Noah Ziegler in the 1870s and was one of the first 2 deeded ranches in what was then known as St. Johns County. As such, the ranch has a long history of intensive grazing by cattle and sheep. When the sheep barn west of headquarters was built in 1951, it was the biggest pole barn between Salina and Denver. The top 2 feet of a nearby stock tank hold 25,000 gallons of water. The tank has a conical bottom 12 feet deep and was fitted with a diving board back in the day. Smoky Valley Ranch is very unique in that it's home to the lesser, greater, and hybrid prairie chicken. This small area of range overlap in western Kansas between the Arkansas River and I-70 occurs nowhere else in the world. Today, range-wide estimates indicate that half to 2/3 of the entire species now occur in this relatively small area. Prairie chickens depend on tall, residual grass for nesting. Prairie chicken males display on a small spot of relatively high ground with low vegetation called a lek. Where nesting habitat is consistent and plentiful, males have returned to the same lek for hundreds of years. Smoky Valley Ranch has 5 such stable lecks. The area's limestone is made up of ancient organic sediments that were deposited while the area was under the massive western interior seaway about 85 million years ago. Much more recently, but still beginning long over a century ago, limestone was mined from the quarry and can be found in and around Oakley, including the high school football stadium and bus barn. Using horse-drawn saws and other crude equipment, skilled stonemasons from the local black settlement used the stone to build many area houses. 2 still stand today on the ranch, just as they did 100 years ago. During these days, the most efficient way to transport large quantities of stone would have been by horse-drawn sled in the winter. In the 30s and 40s, under the Franklin Roosevelt administration, the quarry became a Works Progress Administration WPA project, and masons would use large gas-powered generators with saw blades over 4 feet in diameter. This quarry is but one example of how people depended on the land for nearly every aspect of their lives, as we still do today. How our own human history is really inseparable from the natural history of the places we inhabit. Edith Schoolhouse, District 8, can be seen just north of Indian Road here at the southern extent of the Smoky Valley Ranch. This school would have certainly been an important part of the local African American settlement, and the building likely doubled as the local church, of which Earl Douglas, who lived at the Cupola House, would likely have been the minister. Earl Douglas's wife was named Edith and was likely the head mistress. The American bison is a major feature of the history and ecology of North America's grassland. The bison's nomadic grazing habits were perhaps the most significant non-weather influence on the ecology of the continent's grasslands. Here, just about 15 miles due south of where Buffalo Bill Cody earned his name, Conservancy is contributing to the recovery and genetic integrity of the species. However, the primary function of bison at the ranch is the same as our other livestock, to use grazing as one of the key ecological drivers to restore and maintain the native grassland communities. The Conservancy believes in conservation of our native grasslands, ultimately to ensure that our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren will be able to experience the prairie in the same way our ancestors did, at least in the few places that we still can today. Because of its diverse conservation goals, the ranch is a one-of-a-kind venue for research of the short and mixed grass prairie ecosystem. Several Kansas universities consider the ranch to be a critical part of their biological research programs. Research conducted in partnership with Kansas State University, Fort Hays State University, Emporia State University, and the University of Kansas, and the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism, and several Colorado and other out-of-state universities has made a significant contribution to our understanding of this ecosystem.
A couple years ago, the Conservancy purchased Little Jerusalem Badlands, which actually sit at the southeast corner of the 17,000 acre ranch. And we do plan to offer public access there at the Little Jerusalem Badlands. But we want to be very careful about how we set that up and how we go about offering that access. Since acquiring that property in October of 2016, there's been a lot of public interest. We did some promotion work to raise money to pay for the property when we acquired it. And since that time, there's been a huge amount of public interest in getting to that property. And we really appreciate everyone's patience and allowing us time to think through how to set that up to offer public access. It's going to require a fairly delicate balance. Those chalk formations are really fragile. We want to make sure that the area stays just as pristine as it is today forever. But we also want to make sure that people can get in there and experience it and be you know, it's hard for somebody to enter that kind of property and hard for a kid to see something like that and not be inspired about how cool the prairie is out here in this part of the state. So we feel like it's really important to get people in there, but we also have a deep responsibility to make sure that it stays in the pristine condition that it's in today. We think that the best way to do that is to partner with the state, with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks and Tourism. Currently we're working on developing access plans for that, and the Conservancy would continue to own the property, would continue to oversee management of the property, but the Wildlife and Parks would help us manage the public access there. I think it would be a really beneficial partnership for everyone, so that we can continue to manage the habitat, that it stays in a pristine condition, yet people are able to access it and enjoy it. We're really excited about offering public access already on Smoky Valley Ranch. We have a couple of hiking trails on the west side of the property, and it's a great way to spend a day hiking or horseback riding. You can see a real diversity of plant communities. You can see the Niobrara chalk formations. There's just an incredible amount of human history that's happened in this area and adjacent to the hiking trail. You can learn about that. You can learn about how that natural history really explains why people were using this area throughout history, but also why we still depend on this landscape for our own livelihoods today. So the trailhead is just off of County Road 350 on the west side of the ranch, and we have a kiosk there with some information. We have a brochure where a person can learn about all the different interpretive points that we have, but we are 30 minutes from the nearest town, and so if you're going to come out for a day to use the trail, or for a half day, you'd want to bring water and lunch. Fundamental to what the Conservancy is doing in this part of the prairie is trying to figure out ways to maintain what's left of our native prairie, but also coming up with relevant management that can be used throughout the landscape. And so we do a lot of partnerships with universities to research and develop grazing practices and other management practices. As a person walks through the hiking trail, they can see examples of those grazing management systems. There really is a lot to see and do along the byway. And so a person can go into one of the local museums and learn about the history, and they can come out to the hiking trail and really experience it. You can really imagine that it really doesn't look that much different than it might have 150 years ago.
We encourage you to start your exploration of the Smoky Valley Ranch right here in Oakley at the Buffalo Bill Cultural Center. We can provide you with a map of the hiking trails, offering a 1-mile family-friendly hike or a 5.5-mile route. We can also direct you to other sites along the Western Vistas Historic Byway. There's so much to see and do here in Kansas.
Traveling Kansas Smoky Valley Ranch is underwritten in part by a grant from the Dane G. Hansen Foundation, enriching our lives by sharing our unique stories in Kansas, and by the Buffalo Bill Cultural Center in Oakley, who invite you to begin your travel and experience the Western Vistas Historic Byway, including Fort Wallace, Scott City, and Oakley.
This program is brought to you by the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism. Find out more information about Kansas communities at travelks.com.